Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael, on a Thursday. I want to talk about Pope Benedict XVI's hermeneutic of continuity. It's often called that, but technically he calls it the hermeneutic of reform. Whenever he initiated this in his Christmas address of 2005 to the Roman Curia, I'd like to look through that Christmas address, at least the part that pertains to the hermeneutic of continuity and the Second Vatican Council. I'm going to skip the other stuff there. I think it's important to go over this because there is a lot of confusion about the Second Vatican Council, and Benedict agreed. And so this is one of the reasons why he issued this clarification, if you will, to the College of Cardinals. What we're seeing on pretty much both ends of the spectrum is an error that Benedict tried to offset, tried to correct. There are those who want to see the Second Vatican Council as rupture, and specifically rupture with sacred tradition. Um, Now, he says that's wrong. That's an error, and that is not the way to read the Second Vatican Council. And one of the groups that proposes that would be the people on the left, those who just want to discard sacred tradition and want to read the Second Vatican Council as breaking away from it, as if that were a good thing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who they want to preserve sacred tradition, but they read the Second Vatican Council as betraying sacred tradition. So they then hate the Second Vatican Council because they see it as a rupture, much like the liberals see it as a rupture. They too see it as a rupture, but they don't praise that rupture, they condemn it. And really, both of those groups are wrong. Those who don't want to maintain sacred tradition and want to rupture from it, they're wrong. And those who do want to preserve sacred tradition, but say that the Second Vatican Council ruptured with sacred tradition, they're also wrong. Neither one of those groups are correct. And so, what Pope Benedict does is he offers a different hermeneutic or way of reading the Second Vatican Council that doesn't fall into this error. And really, I think at the time that he wrote this in 2005, he's focused especially on those who see the Second Vatican Council as rupture, but they praise that rupture. Whereas now we're starting to see an aggressive movement from the other end of the spectrum that condemns rupture, but again promotes Vatican II as being in rupture with sacred tradition. And I don't think that that was on his radar as much as it would have been today if he were to deliver this Christmas address today. But both are mistakes, and both of those need to be corrected. So we are going to go through this and get the proper way to interpret the Second Vatican Council from someone who was present there, and of course, someone who speaks authoritatively. So let's go to it. Going to share my screen and skip to the part that pertains to the Second Vatican Council. You should be able to see it now. Okay. The last event of this year on which I wish to reflect here is the celebration of the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council 40 years ago. This memory prompts the question, what has been the result of the council? Yeah, it's a good question. It's one we still ask today. Was it well received? What in the acceptance of the council was good and what was inadequate or mistaken? What still remains to be done? No one can deny that in vast areas of the church, the implementation of the council has been somewhat difficult. Did you catch that? The implementation of Vatican II has been difficult. So, Vatican II itself is one thing, implementation is yet another. He continues, even without wishing to apply to what occurred in these years, the description that St. Basil, the great doctor of the church, made of the church's situation after the Council of Nicaea, which is the first ecumenical council. He compares her situation to a naval battle in the darkest of the storms or darkness of the storm, saying, among other things, quote, "The raucous shouting of those who through disagreement rise up against one another, the incomprehensible chatter, the confused din of uninterrupted clamoring has now filled almost the whole of the church, falsifying through excess or failure the right doctrine of the faith." So he goes over the confusion that was taking place in his day. It says, "We do not want to apply precisely this dramatic description to the situation of the postconciliar period. Yet, something from all that occurred is nevertheless reflected in it. The question arises, why has the implementation of the council in large parts of the church thus far been so difficult?" I think we all agree with him. It has been difficult. And so he's going to tell us why. So here it is. Well, it all depends on the correct interpretation of the council. That's what this boils down to. The correct interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. He says, or as we would say today, on its proper hermeneutics, the correct key to its interpretation and application. You see, there's a difference between what the text says and then how somebody interprets them. For instance, we know with Protestants, we share the vast majority of the Bible together, the same text, and yet we're going to interpret it differently than them on some key points. So the text is one thing, interpretation is another. And he's saying that's where the problem is. It's due to a question of how do we interpret the Second Vatican Council? The problems in its implementation arose from the fact that two contrary hermeneutics came face to face and quarreled with each other. There's two different interpretations, and they're at war with each other. One caused confusion. The other silently, but more and more visibly, bore and is bearing fruit. Well, he says on the one hand, there is an interpretation that I would call a hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture. It has frequently availed itself of the sympathies of the mass media and also one trend of modern theology. On the other hand, there is the hermeneutic of reform, of renewal in the continuity of the one subject church, which the Lord has given to us. She is a subject which increases in time and develops, yet always remaining the same, the one subject of the journeying people. Okay, so there's two main ways to interpret the Second Vatican Council. One is called the hermeneutic of discontinuity or rupture. The other one is called the hermeneutic of reform, or sometimes called continuity. Now, you'll notice, again, as I pointed out, on both extremes, it's not both of these interpretations, right? It's not like on one extreme, the liberals, therefore hermeneutic of discontinuity, and the conservatives, and on the other end of the spectrum are somehow for the hermeneutic of reform. Nope, that's not the situation today. In fact, the situation is this: on both ends of the spectrum, the extreme left, you're going to have a hermeneutic of discontinuity. Extreme right, they're not the hermeneutic of reform. They're the hermeneutic of discontinuity. They see Vatican II as a rupture. They don't hold to the hermeneutic of reform. And if you listen to some of these people, they mock the hermeneutic of reform and draw certain caricatures of them with like half of a drawn horse and then the other half something drawn by a 5-year-old, showing how absurd it is to maintain the hermeneutic of reform. They'll caricature the hermeneutic of reform. So that's the problem that we now have today, an added development or plot twist, if you will, since the time of this address. You have two extreme groups warring against each other, but both holding to the hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture. And there's a smaller amount of people, not as vocal, that hold to a hermeneutic of reform. So I do think that there have been some developments since 2005 with the speech. The hermeneutic of discontinuity risks ending in a split between the post-conciliar and pre-conciliar church. That's right. Those who say Vatican II is a rupture, they're splitting the church between prior to the council and after the council. And again, that's on both ends of the spectrum. It asserts that the text of the council as such do not yet express the true spirit of the council. So in his time, in 2005, at that time, those who are really going for the hermeneutic of discontinuity are saying, look, there's a difference between the spirit of the council and the text itself. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the radical traditionalists, they're not going to maintain that. They're just going to say the text itself is a rupture. So there is going to be a difference there. But both hold to rupture. It's just they hold to it in a different way. But there's a group in the church that wants to say, the text, that's one thing, but the spirit behind the text is another. The spirit of trying to cast off everything from the past, that's really the spirit of Vatican II that we need to follow. Don't worry about the text of Vatican II so much as you should just worry about you should be more concerned about the revolutionary spirit, and you should buy into that revolutionary spirit. He says it claims that they are the result of compromises in which to reach unanimity. It was found necessary to keep and confirm or reconfirm many old things that are now pointless. So those who want to make the distinction between the text itself and the spirit of the text, or the spirit of the council, the spirit of Vatican II, as it's called, they're going to say, well, the reason why Vatican II had that kind of conservative, traditional stuff to it in the text itself is because they weren't ready to just fully break away from those traditions. So the spirit was there to break away from these things, but they weren't fully ready for it. It's kind of like with Martin Luther. You'll hear people say, well, Martin Luther held to some pretty Catholic views. He didn't just completely reject everything from Catholicism. He held to baptismal regeneration and the priesthood and things like that. And people will then respond, well, that's just because he wasn't really ready to shed those things yet. After time, he would have realized that those needed to be cast off, but it was still all pretty new. So there were some things that he had not yet reformed. It's kind of the same idea here. People are saying same thing with the Second Vatican Council, but it's more that spirit behind it, a revolutionary spirit, and that's what we should be following. And he continues, however, the true spirit of the council is not to be found in these compromises, but instead in the impulses towards the new that are contained in the text. So he's saying these people are saying, again, the true spirit of the council is not in the text itself, it's just in this spirit of reform. And reform here being not in continuity with the past, but in specific discontinuity with the past. All right. So we might actually call it, instead of reform, revolution. These innovations alone were supposed to represent the true spirit of the council. And starting from and in conformity with them, it would be possible to move ahead. Precisely because the text would only imperfectly reflect the true spirit of the council and its newness, it would be necessary to go courageously beyond the text and make room for the newness in which the council's deepest intention would be expressed, even if it were still vague. In a word, it would be necessary not to follow the text of the council, but its spirit. In this way, obviously, a vast margin was left open for the question on how this spirit should subsequently be defined, and room was consequently made for every whim. Now, what some people will say, this is just my added commentary, what some people would say in defense of the spirit of Vatican II, they would say, look, we already did this with scripture itself. I mean, with the Old Testament, we went beyond the text itself, beyond literal circumcision and actual sacrifices of animals. We went beyond those and we spiritualized them and we reinterpreted them in a different way. And we went with the spirit of the text rather than the letter of the law. That would be the argument that some people would use. And I would say that that's partly a misunderstanding of what's going on with the relationship between the new covenant and the old covenant. But that's probably where some people will try to go to defend this. It continues, the nature of a council as such is therefore basically misunderstood. So he's saying this is a misunderstanding. The spirit of Vatican II stuff, misunderstanding. In this way, it is considered as a sort of constituent that eliminates an old constitution and creates a new one. However, the Constituent Assembly needs a mandator and then confirmation by the mandator. In other words, the people the Constitution must serve. The fathers had no such mandate, and no one had ever given them one, nor could anyone have given them one, because the essential constitution of the church comes from the Lord. Well, let's just stop there. He's saying Vatican II did not have the authority to create this revolution and to depart with the past in sacred tradition. It did not have that authority, and it can't. It could never have that authority because it's the Lord Jesus himself who established the church. It's not up to the church to determine how the church is going to be established. It's the Lord Jesus who determines how it's going to be established, and he already did that. And he continues, and it was given to us so that we might attain eternal life. And starting from this perspective, be able to illuminate life in time and time itself. Through the sacrament, they had received bishops or stewards of the Lord's gift. They are stewards of the mysteries of God. As such, they must be found to be faithful and wise. This requires them to administer the Lord's gift in the right way so that it is not left concealed in some hiding place, but bears fruit. And the Lord may end by saying to the administrator, since you are dependable in small matter, I will put you in charge of larger affairs. These gospel parables express the dynamic of fidelity required in the Lord's service, and through them it becomes clear that, as in a council, the dynamic of fidelity must converge. The hermeneutic of discontinuity is countered by the hermeneutic of reform, as it was presented by John the 23rd in his speech inaugurating the council on the 11th of October, 62, and later by Paul VI in his discourse for the conclusion of the council on the 7th of December of 65. Here I shall cite only John the 23rd's well-known words, which unequivocally express this hermeneutic when he says that the council wishes to transmit the doctrine pure and integral without any attenuation and distortion. Listen to that. John the 23rd was explaining at the beginning of the council, the purpose of the council is to transmit the doctrine pure and integral without any attenuation or distortion. Not this revolutionary spirit, not to break from the past as far as sacred tradition. No, no, no. And he continues, our duty is not only to guard this precious treasure, as if we were concerned only with it, as if we were concerned only with antiquity, but to dedicate ourselves with an earnest will and without fear to that work which our era demands. So he's saying, look, our purpose is to guard the deposit of faith, but not just to guard it as if all we're doing is, we're just keeping things in a museum. No, what we're to do is guard the deposit of faith and bring it to modern society. It is necessary that adherence to all the teachings of the church in its entirety and preciseness be presented in faithful and perfect conformity to the authentic doctrine, which, however, should be studied and expounded through the methods of research and through the literary forms of modern thought. So he's saying we have to preserve the faith. We can't depart from it. We have to authentically guard sacred tradition and doctrine, but we're to present it in a way that can be communicated to, again, modern man, modern thought. He goes on, the substance of the ancient doctrine of the deposit of faith is one thing, and the way in which it's presented is another. And we certainly know that to be the case historically. I mean, prior to Thomas Aquinas, there were a lot of things that we communicated about the doctrine of the faith that were communicated one way. And then after Aquinas, with their Aristotelian thought, we start to see it communicated in a different way, but not substantially different. It's the same thing. It's the same faith. It was just communicated with a different style, if you will. And he's saying the same thing here. We're to communicate the same teachings, but the style may be a little bit different. We might not use scholastic language when communicating with modern man, for better or worse. It is clear that this commitment to expressing a truth in a new way demands new thinking on this truth and a new and vital relationship with it. It is also clear that new words can only develop if they come from an informed understanding of the truth expressed, and on the other hand, that a reflection of faith also requires that this faith be lived. In this regard, the program that John the 23rd proposed was extremely demanding indeed, just as the synthesis of fidelity and dynamic is demanding. However, wherever this interpretation guided the implementation of the council, new life developed and new fruit ripened. 40 years ago, after the council, we can show that the positive is far greater and livelier than it appeared to be in the turbulent years of 68. So he's saying, look, when 68, after the council, early on, it seems that things were really turbulent. But he's saying it's getting better. In his discourse closing the council, Paul VI pointed out a further specific reason why a hermeneutic of discontinuity can seem convincing. In the great dispute about a man which marks the modern epoch, the council had to focus in particular on the theme of anthropology. It had to question the relationship between the church and her faith on the one hand, and man and contemporary world on the other. So, again, had to juggle with, okay, well, we have the faith, but then we also have this situation with the modern world. How do we communicate the faith to the modern world? The question becomes even clearer if instead of the generic term contemporary world, we opt for another that is more precise. The council had to determine in a new way the relationship between the church and the modern era. This relationship had a somewhat stormy beginning with the Galileo case. It was then totally interrupted with Kant, when Kant described religion with pure reason. And when in the radical phase of the French Revolution, an image of the state and the human being that practically no longer wanted to allow the church any room was disseminated. So there was a huge change in society where society pretty much divorced itself from God and the church. That certainly created a new situation. In the 19th century under Pius IX, the clash between the church's faith and radical liberalism and the natural sciences, which also claim to embrace with their knowledge the whole of reality to its limit, stubbornly proposing to make the hypothesis of God superfluous, had elicited from the church a bitter and radical condemnation of the spirit of the modern age. Thus, it seemed that there was no longer any milieu open to a positive and fruitful understanding, and the rejection by those who felt they were representatives of the modern era was also drastic. In the meantime, however, the modern age had also experienced developments. People came to realize that the American Revolution was offering a model of a modern state that differed from the theoretical model with radical tendencies that had emerged during the second phase of the French Revolution. He's saying there's a difference between the American model of democracy and that which we saw with the French Revolution. The natural sciences were beginning to reflect more and more clearly their own limitations imposed by their own method, which, despite achieving great things, was nevertheless unable to grasp the global nature of reality. So people are starting to see the limits to science, that it can't answer all of the questions. So it was that both parties were gradually beginning to open up to each other, the church and secular society. In the period between the two world wars, especially after the Second World War, Catholic statement demonstrated that a modern secular state could exist that was not neutral regarding values, but alive, drawing from the great ethical sources opened by Christianity. So Catholic statement were showing that you could have a secular state that wasn't neutral, but was actually open to the values of Christianity. Catholic social doctrine, as it gradually developed, became an important model between radical liberalism and the Marxist theory of the state. The natural sciences, which without reservation professed a method of their own to which God was barred access, realized ever more clearly that this method did not include the whole of reality. Hence, they once again opened their doors to God, knowing that reality is greater than the naturalistic method and all that it can encompass. It might be said that these three circles of questions had formed, which then, at the time of the Second Vatican Council, were expecting an answer. First of all, the relationship between faith and modern science had to be redefined. Hmm. So he's saying there's a new situation here with again, secular society and also modern science. And so, because of a lot of changes that have happened, we had to define our relationship and the relationship between faith and science. Furthermore, this did not only concern the natural sciences, but also historical science. For in a certain school, the historical critical method claimed to have the last word on the interpretation of the Bible. It still seems to be the case today. And demanding total exclusivity for its interpretation of sacred scripture was opposed to important points in the interpretation elaborated by the faith of the church. That's an understatement. Certainly, a lot of differences between what some people would tell you with the historical critical method versus what the church says. Secondly, it was necessary to give a new definition to the relationship between church and the modern state that would make room impartially for citizens of various religions and ideologies, merely assuming responsibility for an orderly and tolerant coexistence among them, and for the freedom to practice their own religion. Thirdly, linked more generally to this was the problem of religious tolerance, a question that required a new definition of the relationship between Christian faith and the world religions. In particular, before the recent crimes of the Nazi regime, and in general, with a retrospective look at a long and difficult history, it found necessary to evaluate and define in a new way the relationship between the church and the faith of Israel. These are all subjects of great importance. They were the great themes of the second part of the council, on which it is impossible to reflect more broadly in this context. It is clear that in all these sectors, which altogether form a single problem, some kind of discontinuity might emerge. So, because of differences in society, and because we're having to define our relationship to the modern world, there's going to be some discontinuity because we're not in the same situation any longer as we used to be in. Indeed, a discontinuity had been revealed, but in which, after the various distinctions between concrete historical situations and their requirements had been made, the continuity of principles proved not to have been abandoned. It is easy to miss this fact at first glance. What is he saying here? He's admitting there is some discontinuity. He is admitting that. Let that sink in. Benedict is admitting there's some discontinuity with Vatican II and the period prior to that. But he's saying it's not one of discontinuity with the core principles of the faith. No, those have not been abandoned. Those are continuous. The discontinuity is more with accidental aspects, if you will, non substantial aspects, things that pertain to historical situations. Because our historical situation today is different, the same principles that we have of the faith are going to look a little different in today's day and age versus back then when society was different. Again, the principles have remained the same, but some of the historical situations and then how we relate to society because of those differences in these historical situations, there might be some differences there. It is precisely in this combination of continuity and discontinuity at different levels that the very nature of the true reform consists. All right, so listen to that. Listen to that. He's wanting to balance out continuity and discontinuity because he says both of these have some truth to them, but they're at different levels. The continuity aspect is for the core of the faith, the deposit of faith, sacred tradition, our core principles. That is continuous. But there is some discontinuity with things at a different level that is lower than that, lower than the deposit of faith. And balancing those things out is the task. And I want to say that's still the case today. It was true in 2005. It's also especially true today. And this process of innovation in continuity kind of sounds like a contradiction in terms there, right? Innovation in continuity. However, that's not really foreign to Catholic tradition in 2000 years. We've had some innovations, and yet we would still say we're in continuity substantially with what has been handed down by the apostles. Even if we've had some innovations here and there, they're not at the level of core principles or, dogma or something like that. In this process of innovation and continuity, we must learn to understand more practically than before that the church's decision on contingent matters, for example, certain practical forms of liberalism or a free interpretation of the Bible, should necessarily be contingent themselves, precisely because they refer to a specific reality that is changeable in itself. It was necessary to learn to recognize that in these decisions, it is only the principles that express the permanent aspect, since they remain as an undercurrent, motivating decisions from within. On the other hand, not so permanent are the practical forms that depend on the historical situation and are therefore subject to change. And he mentions an example there. Again, free interpretation of the Bible. So certain methods of interpretation, the historical critical method, for instance. During some parts of history, you have the church, um, really, really shying away from that method, and then for other parts, we opened up to it with some reservations. But that's because of different circumstances historically. But the principles behind it still, nevertheless, are true and continuous. Basic decisions, therefore, continue to be well grounded, whereas the way they are applied to new contexts can change. So, again, the principles is one thing, how we apply them to new situations is another. And that's where you're going to see some discontinuity. Thus, for example, if religious freedom were to be considered an expression of the human inability to discover the truth and thus become a canonization of relativism, then this social and historical necessity is raised inappropriately to the metaphysical level and stripped of its true meaning. That would be to abuse what is meant by religious freedom. It does not mean relativism. Absolutely not. In fact, if you look at Bishop de Smet's Relatio for Dignitatis Humanae, which is the document that Vatican II used to interpret Dignitatis Humanae, the document on religious liberty, he explicitly says there that religious liberty is not religious relativism. He completely explicitly says that not at all. They're not the same thing. So to interpret Dignitatis Humanae that way would be to depart from what was actually intended. Consequently, it cannot be accepted by those who believe that the human person is capable of knowing the truth about God and on the basis of the inner dignity of the truth is bound to this knowledge. It is quite different, on the other hand, to perceive religious freedom as a need that derives from human coexistence, or indeed as an intrinsic consequence of the truth that cannot be externally imposed, but that the person must adopt only through the process of conviction. You can't impose faith on somebody. Faith is a gift according to Scripture. And by the way, the Relatio mentions this. Faith is a gift. Therefore, faith can't be imposed by force on an individual. They have to freely come to the conviction of Christ. Okay, so the Second Vatican Council, let's see here, recognizing and making its own essential principle of the modern state with the decree on religious freedom, has recovered the deepest patrimony of the church. By doing so, she can be conscious of being in full harmony with the teachings of Jesus himself, which is referencing give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's, as well as with the church of the martyrs of all times. The ancient church naturally prayed for the emperors and political leaders out of duty. But while she prayed for the emperors, she refused to worship them and thereby clearly rejected the religion of the state. The martyrs of the early church died for their faith in that God who was revealed in Jesus Christ, and for this very reason, they also died for freedom of conscience and the freedom to profess one's own faith, a profession that no state can impose. So he's saying the martyrs died for this very idea of religious freedom, properly understood. Properly understood. not as a caricature, but properly understood. They died for that. Again, a profession that no state can impose, but which instead can only be claimed with God's grace and freedom of conscience. And that's again because faith is a gift. It's not something you can impose by force. A missionary church known for proclaiming her message to all people must necessarily work for the freedom of the faith. She desires to transmit the gift of God or gift of the truth that exists once and for all. At the same time, she assures people and their governments that she does not wish to destroy their identity and culture by doing so, but to give them, on the contrary, a response, which in the innermost depths they are waiting for, a response with which the multiplicity of cultures is not lost, but instead unity between men and women increases, and thus also peace between peoples. The Second Vatican Council, with its new definition on the relationship between the faith of the church and certain essential elements of modern thought, has reviewed or even corrected certain historical decisions. Listen to that. Listen to that. He's saying there were some historical decisions that have been corrected by Vatican II. He doesn't state specifically what they are. But obviously, there's going to be some discontinuity there. There have been some certain historical decisions that needed to be corrected and were corrected. But in this apparent discontinuity, it has actually preserved and deepened her innermost nature and true identity. So, in correcting these things, we're actually being more faithful to our patrimony by doing so. The church, both before and after the council, was and is the same church. One holy, Catholic, and apostolic, journeying on through time. It's the same church. It's not a different church. She continues her pilgrimage amidst the persecution of the world and consolations of God, proclaiming the death of the Lord until he comes. Those who expected that with this fundamental yes to the modern era, all tensions would be dispelled and that the openness towards the world accordingly achieved would transform everything into pure harmony, had underestimated the inner tensions as well as the contradictions inherent in the modern epoch. So for those who, had a overly optimistic notion of the relationship between the church and the modern world, they had underestimated the problems in the world. They had underestimated the perilous frailty of human nature. Original sin, which had been a threat to human progress in all the periods of history and in every historical constellation. These dangers, with the new possibilities and new power of man over and over himself, did not disappear, but instead acquired new dimensions. A look at the history of the present day shows this clearly. Yeah. In our time, too, the church remains a sign that will be opposed. Not without reason did John Paul II, then still a cardinal, give this title to the theme of the spiritual exercises he preached in 1976 to Paul VI and the Roman Curia. The council could not have intended to abolish the gospel's opposition to human dangers and errors. On the contrary, it was certainly the council's intention to overcome erroneous or superfluous contradictions in order to present our world the requirement of the gospel and its greatness and purity, its full greatness and purity. And by the way, Dignitatis Humanae talks about that. It talks about the duty to share the gospel and for people to embrace the one true religion, the Catholic Church. It explicitly says that at the very beginning of Dignitatis Humanae. The steps the council took towards the modern era, which had vaguely been presented as openness to the world, belong in short to the perennial problem of the relationship between faith and reason that is reemerging in new forms. The situation that the council had to face can certainly be compared to events of previous epochs. In his first letter, St. Peter urged Christians always to be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks them for the logos, or the word, the reason for their faith. This meant that the biblical faith had to be discussed and come into contact with Greek culture and learn to recognize through interpretation the separating line, but also the convergence and the affinity between them in the one reason given by God. In the 13th century, through the Jewish and Arab philosophers, Aristotelian thought came into contact with medieval Christianity, formed in the Platonic tradition. And faith and reason risked entering in an irreconcilable contradiction. There was some tension between the Christian faith that had really grown in a Platonic model, that is, after the thought of Plato, or at least expressed according to the thought of Plato, and um, which it encountered with Aristotle from Jewish and Arab philosophers. There was some tension here, and there were also some things in Aristotle that were incompatible with the Christian faith. So there was a risk here of, okay, well, how can we even adopt this thought from Aristotle if there are some aspects to Aristotelianism that is at odds with the Christian faith? It was above all St. Thomas Aquinas who mediated the new encounter between faith and Aristotelian philosophy, therefore setting faith in a positive relationship with a form of reason prevalent in his time. There is no doubt that the wearing dispute between the modern reason and the Christian faith, which had begun negatively with the Galileo case, went through many phases. But with the Second Vatican Council, the time came when broad new thinking was required. It was certainly, people ask, well, why did we need to change? What was the purpose of the Second Vatican Council? He's answering. He's telling you. There were changes in society. Its content was certainly only roughly traced in the conciliar text, but this determined its essential direction, so that the dialogue between reason and faith, particularly important today, found its bearing on the basis of the Second Vatican Council. This dialogue must now be developed with great open-mindedness, but also with that clear discernment that the world rightly expects of us in this very moment. Thus, today we look at gratitude at the Second Vatican Council. If we interpret it, implement it, guided by a right hermeneutic, it can be and become increasingly powerful for the ever necessary renewal of the church. So he's saying it actually could help tremendously to renew the church if we just properly implement the Second Vatican Council. How do you do that? Use the hermeneutic of reform, not rupture. Okay, and so that's pretty much the end of that. He has some closing words after that, but they're not really related to the hermeneutic of continuity, so we'll end there. So I hope this was helpful in maybe explaining why we needed the Second Vatican Council, at least very briefly, and also perhaps how we should go about in interpreting it. What is the correct hermeneutical method, if you will? All right. Again, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, hit the like button and the subscribe button. Please help me grow this channel by hitting that subscribe button. And also check me out at patreon.com/reason and theology. You'll get access to extra content and you'll be supporting me so I can continue to offer these shows. Okay, guys, we'll see you later. God bless. Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the Magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. God bless.